When Claire told Diana about dropping from the sky in her truck and losing 2 hours of time, Diana didn't have to believe her. Diana is Claire's boss. She could have fired Claire and hired someone else, but she didn't. Perhaps it was loyalty or friendship, or perhaps it was something else.
I tried to help Claire as much as I could, but she didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to deal with it at all. She was just hoping it would go away and it really wouldn't happen again.
I want everything normal. I want to be in control. And I felt very out of control.
But my reaction was completely different. I wasn't involved. I had nothing to do with it.
But when Claire had her second experience, Diana began to feel that she was involved. Diana's mind was set in motion, and for her too, a trickle of memories began.
She remembered a little bit more of that incident, and it seemed a little stranger to me, and it got me thinking to a time a couple years back when we had seen some really bright lights outside the back door and gone out on the porch and watched them, and we were just thoroughly fascinated that we have actually seen a UFO. So I started finding every book I could on the subject and started reading like crazy. It was fascinating to me.
Life on the farm had to go on. There were chores to do, pregnant mares to care for. But both women noticed that a blanket of strangeness had descended over their lives. Everywhere they turned, something seemed odd or out of place. At first, they chalked it up to imagination or coincidence, until disturbing events happened too often to ignore.
As Claire had more and more memories, it got stranger and stranger. She started having memories of strange hands. We connected the lights we'd seen a couple years earlier.
When we started becoming more aware of what was going on around us, we realized that there were an awful lot of very odd coincidences. Coincidences like journal entries that were on the computer disappearing entirely, lights going on and off by themselves, whether they're plugged in or not, televisions going on and off by themselves, clocks stopping consistently at 3 a.m. every morning, going to bed with clean-shaven legs and waking up with hairy legs. After a while, you start to wonder if these are really coincidences or if there isn't some other explanation for them.
I got concerned when I knew we couldn't handle it anymore. I knew we needed more help and more knowledge than we had. So I started looking through the phone book, and luckily I found the Fund for UFO Research. I called them and talked with them, and my first question was, is it possible for somebody to be kidnapped by a UFO? They didn't want to give us too much information from what they knew, but it just seemed that everything that Claire was telling them was all too familiar to them. It matched patterns that they knew about that we knew nothing about, and it was kind of frightening.
As we learned more and more about this phenomenon and began to remember more and more about it, both Diana and I began to realize that we were associating everything that happened to us practically with this phenomenon, with abductions, with aliens, with UFOs, and we're becoming paranoid. We had to learn to separate what was real and explainable, although maybe a little strange, with something that was truly connected to what was happening to us. And there's a very fine line between the two.
When Fred returned from his failed comedy gig in Vermont, after a bizarre sighting and missing time, he couldn't help but tell someone. Sometimes he wishes he'd kept his mouth shut.
As soon as I got back to town, I mean, it was the only thing I could talk about. It was the biggest thing that had ever happened to me, and I couldn't keep quiet about it. But, you know, I was telling other comedians about it, and they're not the people to tell.
Fred's UFO stories started to damage his reputation in the business.
I told one producer who was a former air traffic controller, and he just would have nothing to do with it. He just said, "Oh, you're talking to the wrong person here," and stopped giving me work.
But a damaged reputation wasn't the only problem Fred faced.
It just shattered my confidence. I mean, the key to doing comedy, to putting it over, is to be self-confident. And, you know, especially with the type of stuff I do, the self-deprecating stuff, it's right on the edge where if you know, you don't do it right, the audience isn't going to buy it. I couldn't really focus on jokes when I've got UFOs plaguing my thoughts. I want my career back.
So, Fred writes to comedy clubs and agents, like a man in deep water, reaching out to those who can keep him from sinking. But in truth, Fred's nemesis now is his own mind. And until he reaches into it and digs deeper into the mystery of his missing time, he knows his career will remain on hold. What is it that drives a person to dig deeper into the mystery of missing time? After their trip, Jim and Jack Weiner tried to get on with their normal lives, but their lives weren't normal anymore. The first clue was a change in their artwork.
As soon as we got back from this trip, my clay work changed immediately. I was suddenly starting to make these really bizarre kind of objects, and they were very anthropomorphic. So, you know, I couldn't figure out why. All I knew was that, you know, before this trip to the Allagash, I was thinking one way, and after the trip, I was thinking another way. And my brother's work changed just as abruptly. Before the trip, I did naturalistic paintings, landscapes, still lives, stuff like that. That's all I did in paint, oil paints. And as soon as I came back, I never painted again in oil paints. I never did a still life or anything. I just started making these bizarre, intricate mathematical drawings. He said, Jim, don't ask me, you know, how or why I'm doing this. I have no idea. It was almost like a total obsession.
Was it possible that something was buried in their subconscious, struggling to surface? The second clue was their dreams.
Years later, and it was only a few years later, I started having nightmares. Really strange and disturbing nightmares. Only they were recurring nightmares. And that's the only way I can rationalize them to myself, because to me they seemed almost like real events. It would always start the same way, where I'd be in this space that I didn't know where I was. In a room, on some kind of a table. Jim and Charlie and Chuck were also there, and we were naked. I remember thinking, where are my clothes? And thinking, why are we all naked in this space? Feeling totally helpless, paralyzed. This creature or something, it was inhuman, would approach me from this haze, this bright haze, and it would just look in my face. They seemed absolutely real to me. I would feel terrified, absolutely terrified, unable to move, and I would wake up screaming, totally drenched in sweat, just going crazy. And I was like literally petrified to the point where I was padlocking myself in my bedroom at night, you know, and I consider myself a fairly rational person.